Hi, I'm so delighted to be here with you today. And this panel is so special to me. It was a very hard panel to prepare for because there's so much to address when we speak of human rights. My name is Nora Gherbi and I'm the founder of Who Cares Chronicles. The year 2020, the COVID-19 crisis has created an opportunity for us to redefine and expand on our human rights. We should make use of all the expertise of the speakers here with us today to ensure that this crisis does not undermine our common values and principles. The safeguarding of human rights during a global crisis should and must be paramount. It is also important to reaffirm that corporations and the business arena can and should provide a strong foothold for human and animal rights. Before I introduce our panelists, and because the summit is rooted in positive actions, I would like to announce an initiative that will be launched by a company called Kimono. Kimono is a corporate culture design agency based in Paris with international clients. And in a few days, Kimono will launch the Culture Pact. Human rights should not be left at the door of a business entity. The Culture Pact is the first commitment towards a new era of companies to which we should all contribute. We need companies that demonstrate to their ecosystem that their activity is rooted in transparency, equality, and reverence for our planet. These values should be what guides their growth. You can reach me on Who Cares Chronicles or Kimono with a Y to find out more about the pact. Today, we have many experts with us that will approach all the various aspects of human rights in their context: disability rights, LGBT rights, women rights, digital rights, environmental rights. So it's an honor for me to be joined by such inspiring leaders and activists. But to start, and as myself an expert in the environment, and in recognition of the pact and the pledge I have made myself to the planet, and as an indigenous person myself, I would like to bring forth climate rights. This is really what we're all here for. No planet, no people, no humans, no human rights. In recent years, we have all been invited to reflect on the interconnectedness of human beings, animals, and living systems. A proposed action is the inclusion of indigenous ancestral wisdom as it relates to the environment. All states and all businesses, enterprises, and there were many here for those 3 days, have a duty to protect the climate and regenerate it and to respect the rights to a secure, healthy, and ecologically sound Earth system for all human beings, animals, and living ecosystems. So today, it's very important for us to reaffirm, recognize, and expand on environmental rights. So it is an honor to start with Nemonte and Nenquimo. Thank you so much, Nemonte, for being part of this panel, and to your team, the Amazon Frontlines. Nemonte is a mother, an indigenous activist, and a member of the Guarani Nation from the Amazonian region of Ecuador. She's the first female president of the Guarani and co-founder of the indigenous-led nonprofit organization Sabo Alliance. In 2020, she was named in the Time 100 list of the most influential people in the world. She's the only indigenous woman on the list and the second Ecuadorian ever to be named in its history. Nenquimo was the plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Ecuadorian government, which culminated in a 2019 ruling that protects 500,000 acres of Guarani ancestral land in the Amazon rainforest from oil drilling. In recognition of her work, in 2020, the United Nations Environment Program gave her the Champions of the Earth Award. She is the recipient of the 2020 Goldman Prize. Thank you again, Nemonte, for your dedication and being part of this and answering my call. And thank you for being a guardian of the Amazon rainforest. We all depend on it. I will let her speak now from the Amazon Guarani land.
Buenos días a todos, a todas. Mi nombre es Nemonte Nenquimo. Soy mujer guarani, líder y madre, y la Amazonía es mi casa. Mi nombre significa constelación de las estrellas. Estoy contenta por participar y dar oportunidad a este panel a nombre de la Nora Gherbi. Gracias, Nora, por invitar a esta ChangeNOW. Bueno, yo nací en comunidad de Toñampari, donde donde existe selva, donde no existe internet, donde no existe telefónica, nada, solo donde existían mis familias, de mis tíos y los abuelos. Donde yo crecí es una diversidad grande, donde tú puedes ver árboles, donde tú puedes caminar a recolectar las frutas selváticas, donde tú puedes caminar a pescar, donde tú puedes ver los animales, los insectos, todo lo que tenemos en nuestra selva. En la selva también nosotros tenemos la importancia de la vida, de la espiritual conexión, cascada con los animales, todo esa forma yo he crecido sanamente, también comiendo las comidas sanas de la selva mismo, todo lo que yo he crecido, aprendí mucho de la vida. La selva me ha enseñado de crecer y respetar la tierra madre, y también mis abuelos, mis parientes, mis padres me han enseñado de cómo vivir en la selva. Ahora actualmente veo la selva está amenazada por capitalismo, pero nuestro territorio está todavía lleno de vida virgen, como 180,000 hectáreas alrededor, que tenemos animales, pescas, los plantas, todo tenemos. La selva es muy importante porque nos ha tenido por miles, siglos, años, nuestros abuelos, nuestros antepasados defendían, y hasta ahora tenemos esa diversidad. Seguimos luchando, seguimos protegiendo para la vida misma, lo que nosotros amamos, lo que protegemos por miles de años, nos estamos aportando al global en la planeta, porque sin agua, sin aire, sin oxígeno no podemos vivir nosotros como humanidad. Queremos que la gente de afuera escuche y que tengan conciencia que realmente estamos luchando por la vida. No es para la vida de los pueblos, sino la humanidad que vivimos en ese planeta. Eso tienen que tener, despertar y escuchar conciencia, de apoyar, de aliarse, porque solo pueblos indígenas hemos venido protegiendo más de larga vida para sostener equilibrio de ese planeta que tanto provoca cambio climático. Hoy en día sentimos amenazado, por eso queremos que ustedes como gente están escuchando, nos apoyen, nos alien ese proceso de lucha, que empecemos a pensar y empecemos de accionar. Muchas de las veces nosotros como pueblos indígenas protestamos, hablamos, no hacen caso. Sigue mandando el gobierno a nuestro territorio el petróleo, la carretera, deforestación, minas, muchas cosas. Si no respetan, va a seguir explotando. Nosotros como pueblos indígenas directamente seremos afectados, muertos. Pero yo también creo que también afectará en el cambio climático todos los seres humanos que estamos viviendo, que muchas de las veces ahora en este momento estamos viviendo con una pandemia. ¿Por qué la gente, ustedes creen, por qué se está surgiendo pandemia? Porque estamos destruyendo, porque estamos contaminando el aire, estamos ensuciando el agua, estamos torturando a la madre tierra. La madre tierra está esperando que respetemos. La madre tierra no está esperando que salvemos nosotros. Eso ustedes tienen que tener conexión para que abren y que pongan a trabajar. No esperen, esa lucha es para pueblos indígenas, sino todos humanos que estamos viviendo en ese planeta. Se necesita ese respeto, se necesita esa equilibrio para que nuestros hijos futuros que vendrán tendrán esa oportunidad de vivir con ese bosque, el aire puro y el agua que no puede seguir más afectando en el mundo.
Unos 5 segundos más mirando acá, por favor.
And we're back. Her message is so strong, and I really want to mention that you can support the Amazon Frontlines team and Nemonte's work. I can help you with Who Cares Chronicles. You can connect with me for all the attendees, or directly with the Amazon Frontlines or ChangeNOW to see how you can support. We're going to continue with our panelists. I'm going to start by just mentioning all their names, and then Giles, we're going to do this in a conversation style. Giles Duley, we have Amanda Nguyen in DC, we have Jody Patterson in New York, and Ndaba Mandela in South Africa. We're expecting one more person, but it is live, so we may have a little issue with the data point of human rights. Giles, you want to start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, I am Giles Duley, and I'm a photographer and founder of the Legacy of War Foundation. And we work as an organization helping communities to rebuild after conflict.
And you are here to represent?
Yeah, I mean, I'm here to represent those living with disabilities. Most specifically, my work is focused on those living with disability post-conflict and their rights.
And when you and I discussed in preparation, one of the things that I was curious, because I've spoken to other people with disabilities to prepare for this panel, and I understood that depending on which country you are, and for yourself you're in the UK, life is easier.
You know, life is easier. I mean, I'll start maybe by telling a couple of stories very briefly about some of the people that I work with. Because one of the maybe neglected human rights is those living with disabilities in conflict zones, where many rights are taken away and not thought about. Three quick examples. Katrina, a woman from South Sudan who was living in a refugee camp in Uganda. When I met her, she was in a wheelchair, but because of the setup, they had built a toilet for her, which seemed like the right thing to do. But nobody had thought, and they'd put a large step going up into this toilet outside her tent, so she was unable to access it. I think of Odai. Odai was in Gaza in 2014 when it was bombed by the Israelis. He did not hear, because he's deaf, the signs and the warnings to get out, and so he is now paralyzed. I also think of my dear friend Khulud, who is a Syrian refugee living in Lebanon. When I met her, she was living in a makeshift tent that her family had made themselves from bits of plastic, cardboard, and even billboard posters ripped down. She's tetraplegic, having been shot by a sniper. Now, because of her living with that disability, she was unable to access most of the other facilities and things that were able there for refugees. So this is a situation for many people living in conflict zones, that their human rights are completely taken away from them. So that's my focus. But I want to bring it back, actually, to something a little bit closer to home. You know, you said it's easier for me living in the UK, and it is. And I'm incredibly grateful that I have 2 prosthetic legs. You know, I'm able to travel the world. I work exactly as I did before my injuries. But if we're going to talk about human rights, and we're talking about major issues like I just mentioned, we also need to go back to the mindset of people, even in the UK. I'll give you an example. I got approached by an advertising agency quite recently. A big ad agency is working with a big company that wanted to do a campaign during the Paralympics. They were ticking a box by trying to find a director for this advert who was living with a disability. So I was approached, and I was sent the storyboard of what this campaign was going to be. Essentially, it was lots of quick shots of people with different disabilities speaking something to camera. And they were comments like, you know, I also get bank debts. I also get credit card debts. I also get angry with my mother-in-law. My favorite was somebody in a shower going, and if I'm lucky, sometimes I get lucky. Now, I wrote back and I explained why I had these reservations with it. I was then blanked. I've now found that that ad is still happening, but with a different director, obviously a fully able director. Now, why was I angry about that? Well, just think about it for a minute. Those were not talking about achievements. Those were simply talking about everyday things that people deal with. And I said, in 2021, are you telling me I still have to justify that I have the same emotions as you? Are you telling me that I have to justify that I have love, I have anger, I have basic stuff? This was not about people achieving anything. This was simply saying, I am human. Yeah. And the fact that a big ad agency would still think that that was an important message to get across in 2021. Now, I deal with many agencies, many media companies, many big companies, governments that tell me that they represent me. They represent people living with disabilities, including charities that work with disability. Now, until I see myself reflected on your board and in your teams, do not say you represent me.
Such a good point. The purpose of this panel is exactly that, is to give a voice and to really bring forth the fact that in 2021, we still, sadly, have a lot of work to do in the context of human rights. We also have Jody Patterson in New York. You and I are friends, so I'm not going to introduce you because I could go on forever, because I'm such a fan of yours, my sister. Please tell us who you are, Jody Patterson.
Hi, everyone. Good evening or good morning, depending on where in the world you are. I know how political and how charged the issue of LGBTQAI rights are, but I want to approach it a bit differently. I'm Jody Patterson. I'm not a politician. I'm not a doctor, nor a sociologist. I'm a mother, and I'm raising 5 young Black children, one who's transgender. And when you look at this time where politicians and doctors, faith leaders and media outlets, even educators are stirring up what feels like a war against my son, it becomes my responsibility to bring the little truth of the world that I witnessed to the forefront so it doesn't go unseen or worse, erased. So Nora, when you ask me what I do, I'm a mother. I'm also the chair of the Human Rights Campaign Foundation Board, which is our largest LGBT human rights organization globally. I've been paying attention to this topic now for years. In 2020, at least 350 trans-identified people were killed globally. It was one of our deadliest years to date. So I take my job as mother very seriously. With our current climate, which is clearly anti-LGBT and clearly anti-trans, my job has become to puzzle out the deeper meaning of who our children are from the inside out. They're more than their bodies, and they're definitely more than our laws make them out to be. It's my responsibility to share that information with you, people with influence and power, who our children truly are, because from what I can see, from my perspective, much of the world has the wrong impression of not only my son, but of millions of people. About 10 years ago, I didn't even know what the word transgender meant, until one day my 3-year-old said to me, "Mama, I am not a girl, I am a boy." I was confused. At first, I thought here was a girl who wanted to be seen as tough, right, and equal to the boys. I thought I had failed to raise a proud feminist. Penelope was only 3 at the time, but that's when my parents started teaching me about bold women. And we have a lot of civil rights leaders in my family who are women. So I tried everything I could think of to fix this problem, this poor child, I thought. More love, more attention. But the more I tried to fix things, the more my child slipped away. "Mama, I don't want tomorrow to come," right? Because tomorrow I will look like you. "I love you, Mama, but I don't want to be you. I want to be Papa." It took me some time, but now I understand my child to be transgender. And of course, I no longer want to fix him. I want to fix the bias and the discrimination and the laws that limit and restrict his life and place him in grave danger. More than 50% of trans teens attempt suicide because of bullying and rejection and invisibility. I don't need to tell you this, but I'll remind us here today, it's dangerous to be different. People are killed for being different. In 13 countries, it's criminal to be trans, punishable by prison, corporal punishment, sometimes death. And then by de facto law, it's criminal to be trans in 37 countries. Same-sex relationships are illegal in 76 countries, punishable by death in at least 5. I've witnessed, in New York, where I live, multiple levels of hatred for my child. People are confused by him. His transness, layered with his Blackness, are used against his humanity. When my son steps into the public, many people are angry. At 13, he angers people, and millions of other trans people anger us. And they believe that my son is dangerous and sick, crazy. My son is none of those things. He's a straight A student, graduating valedictorian from his class. He's a team player, a loving sibling, a great best friend. Yet people have tried to erase my son through laws and rollbacks. They've tried to put him in his place by force. They've tried to remove him from society by embarrassing him. We can't let that happen. I've decided this moment in history and why I'm here today with you requires mothering. I'm here to bring mothering first and foremost, building up our communities, collaborating, bringing people together, and establishing a no child loss policy. In 2021, LGBTQAI people are not fully seen by the majority of the world. And in order to see and protect the LGBT community, we need new information. The words, the language, the history, the science of gender and sexual diversity are not things most of us are taught in school. So I had to learn them on my own. And when we don't understand things, they become scary. And when things are scary, we want to avoid them and make them go away. There are sports bans and medical bans and bathroom bans, all trying to make people who are different go away. In America, where I live, this year we've seen over 100 anti-trans bills in state legislature across the country, from policing trans girls in sports to criminalizing gender-affirming care for minors, and over 250 anti-LGBT bills. 2021 has officially been the worst year for anti-LGBT legislation in the states. These attacks, and let me be clear, they're brutal attacks, are part of a broader effort to stigmatize, punish, and banish people who identify as transgender. I don't know how to solve this super wicked problem of LGBT hatred, but I do know some things we can do to make life better. We can change our hearts and minds by getting to know the people we are trying to ban. Ask yourself, do you know any trans people? Do you know any queer people? Get to know my son. I share my life so that you can understand us better. In order to update our commitment to human rights, we have to update our lives and practice close proximity to the people who are different from us.
Thank you, Jody.
The type of change.
Oh, sorry.
Yes,
Sorry.
thank you.
Thank you so much.
No, go ahead.
I really want to get to Amanda as well, to introduce herself and tell us who you are, what you do. I mean, most people here know who you are and all the incredible work you've been doing. And I'm a big fan of yours as well. I've been following your work for quite some time now. And I'm pleased to see that you keep bringing forth such important rights for us women and beyond that.
Well, thank you so much. It's such a delight to be here. And to everyone who is tuning in, I just want to say thank you for holding space for this conversation. I know this past year has been difficult for so many different reasons. And whether you are in person or you are tuning in from around the world, I just want to reach through the camera and say my gratitude and that you are not alone. My name is Amanda, and I fight for the rights of sexual assault survivors. I'm the CEO and founder of Relive, where we pass civil rights laws. We actually just passed 2 more yesterday, so I'm so proud of my team. You know, my story started in activism nearly accidentally. I had already cared about these issues, but I had no idea how tough it actually is until I became a rape survivor myself. I remember still walking out of the hospital after my rape kit examination, which is the life-saving medical attention and the forensic evidence that's collected after one's rape. Mine was 6 hours long in the hospital. Most people don't know that it can be 3 to 7 hours long in the United States. And as I was walking out, I'd been there all night. The sun was rising. And I was handed a taxi voucher to go back to the place where I was raped. And I never more fully understood the definition of lonely until that moment. And so I realized then that my story is not mine alone. When I went into my local area rape crisis center, there weren't enough seats for us in the waiting room. And even if I had access to resources, access to an attorney, I thought to myself, oh my goodness, what is everybody else here going through if they don't have the resources that I do? My rape case in particular, in Massachusetts, at the time before my law passed, my rape kit would be destroyed, could be destroyed at 6 months, untested, even if the statute of limitations is 15 years. And there are double standards. No other type of crime routinely destroys untested evidence. For instance, in murder cases, that's how cold cases are solved. So I thought to myself, okay, I have a choice here. I can accept this injustice or rewrite the law, and one of these things is a lot better than the other. So long story short, I drafted and passed the Sexual Assault Survivor Bill of Rights unanimously through the United States Congress, and since then it's inspired many laws. We just passed our 42nd law yesterday. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's so incredible. I have to mention that at the first ChangeNOW, I've been a partner of ChangeNOW since its inception, and I've quoted you, and I would love for you to say that quote here today, because you're going to say it much better than I did. Because you're a space expert.
Yes,
you're an astronaut.
My first love is astrophysics and space. So when astronauts go into space for the first time, many of them experience what's called the overview effect. It's seeing everyone that's ever lived or died, right? Everything that's ever lived or died on this pale blue dot. And it gives them this orbital perspective. Honestly, it's an existential crisis because what they realize is, why are we all fighting? We are on this spaceship Earth together, on this rock that is floating through space. So many of them leave Earth as technical people, but return to Earth as humanitarians, profoundly moved to give back. So when I need perspective, I think about the overview effect, and I think that you don't have to go to space necessarily. I mean, I will, I hope so, but you don't need to go to space in order to have that orbital perspective.
Thank you so much. So we're not closing the loop here today. We're going to continue to have you be a participant of ChangeNOW, and I want this panel to be a yearly rendezvous, like we say in French, to continue to discuss human rights, because human rights are not statics. We evolve. As we evolve, we need our human rights to evolve with us. And to continue this discussion, I have one more person here with us, and I'm so happy to share the stage with you, Ndaba. Ndaba, you're in South Africa with us. Can you tell us more about who you are and what you do?
Yes. Well, greetings to everybody that is tuned in right now. And I must say I was touched by every single one of our speakers, including Nemonte all the way in Amazon. So I'll tell you that my name is Ndaba Mandela. My name Ndaba means the bringer of news, the maker of news. I'm all about bringing you what's current in the world. Now, I started a foundation here in South Africa called Africa Rising, which is all about youth empowerment. As you can imagine, our kids here in Africa don't have access to, extramurals, the sports, even going to a bowling pin or even to movies, right? So what is it that kids do in their spare time, right? They'll have sex, they'll start early drinking, and that comes with a whole lot of social issues, right? And so we decided to come up with something that would go to these very rural areas and engage with them and find out what are their dreams, but try to even expand their horizon. Because as kids grow up, the only career they see are the ones that they see. They never think they could be a pilot or an astronaut, right? So we bring them people. For example, we partnered with the South African National Defense Force, Air Force, to come to our village with a chopper, and you can imagine the reaction of the kids seeing a chopper for the first time. Now then, I released a book in 2018 called Going to the Mountain, Life Lessons from My Grandfather. And in this book, I really just wanted to share a different perspective of Nelson Mandela. We all know him as a revolutionary, as a president, as a moral leader, but do we know what he was like as a grandfather? I wanted young people to relate to Nelson Mandela and see him as a grandfather. And what are the lessons that he taught me as a young man? And through that success of launching that book in America and in Europe, I realized that people had quite an admiration. And so we started an organization in New York called the Mandela Institute for Humanity. Now, we are very passionate about leadership and, of course, fighting the HIV/AIDS epidemic. But for this particular event, I will talk about leadership. Because if you talk about leadership, we'll say Mandela was one of the greatest, right, leaders. So why don't we take the values of Nelson Mandela and dissect it and say, what is the leadership style of Nelson Mandela, so that we can use those to inspire the next generation of young leaders to lead like a Nelson Mandela. So what is passion? How do you apply that to your work? Discipline, having patience, right? But also conviction and passion versus compassion. So for me, when I'm looking at the current world that we're living in, with this epidemic, with this coronavirus epidemic, I think about how many of the human rights have been infringed upon during this time, right? First of all, this vaccine has not been tested on animals, right? Number two, ladies and gentlemen, they lock us down, they close all the shops, and they ask us to not do anything. But how are we going to continue to put food on the table, right? Whether you are LGBTQI, whether you have gone through a very bad case of being neglected, or you're an orphan, right? Or you are a person that has lost a limb due to a landmine, in South Sudan, right? What is happening in this world is that our human rights continue to be infringed upon. And now in Europe, you're going to have a vaccine pass. If you don't have a vaccine pass, well, you can't go to a restaurant. Well, now you don't have freedom of movement. Now you don't have freedom of self-determination. And this is what, for me, is really the problem that we're facing in this world of today. Sorry. Are we back here? Are we here?
Yeah, we see you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we need to find ways to connect with each other regardless of the dynamics that we are faced. Because at the end of the day, we are reaching out to our own humanity to say, as humanity, ultimately we face the same destiny. So how do we make sure that we control some of these factors that seem insurmountable to work together in a way that our rights can still be protected by us first and foremost? But if we have to go against government, so be it. We believe in a peaceful protest. We believe in peaceful marches. But what recourse do our people have when they are locked down and they can't even, do a job to put food on the table?
Thank you, Ndaba, for this introduction. And it's true that you work on so many different aspects: education, healthcare. One thing that struck me as I was prepared for this panel, and we're going to have one more person joining us on data, but one thing that strikes me even now is that if we were to look at the construction of this panel, we're all, quote unquote, minorities. And there's something that I read a few days ago, and I didn't know if I liked it, or it just kind of disturbed me a little bit, but it was very powerful in the words. And when we prepared for this, we discussed how language was important and how difficult it is to be an activist today and to fight for human rights. But the quote, I'm going to quote it because, no man is an island. I get inspirations from everyone. But Janelle Kubich, who happens to be a psychotherapist and an expert on mental health, and who was recently appointed as the chair of the Maryland Governor's Commission on Suicide Prevention. I even learned that she's a suicidologist, which I didn't even know existed. She said a few days ago on Twitter, we're not minorities, we have been minoritized, and we're not underrepresented, we have been historically excluded. Language matters. Giles, do you agree with that, and how do you feel about this? And then I'll get on to you guys, because this is meant to be a conversation.
Yeah, it's nice to have you all kind of behind us here. Language is hugely important. I mean, I'm a photographer. So in some ways, visual language is really, really vital for me. But also as somebody who set up an NGO and a foundation, language became really, really important to me. And actually the word I want to talk about is empowerment. Mm-hmm. And I have I suppose I was given a gift by life. I was a humanitarian photographer. I was documenting conflicts, very much looking at human rights as I was doing that. But I was doing that from a position of white privilege. I'm a guy that was born in London. I had no disability at the time. I was able to travel, able to do what I wanted to do. Now, I was trying to do the right thing, but my perspective very much was about photographing people with disabilities, trying to represent them, trying to get their stories out. But in many ways, you know, I thought of this idea of empowerment, that I was maybe helping to empower them. When I got injured, and when I lost both my legs in Afghanistan in 2011, spent a year in hospital, when I came out, I was in a wheelchair. And I remember being spat at on the street in London.
That's incredible.
And my journey had gone completely in a very different direction. And so suddenly that white privilege, I was seeing it from a very different perspective. And I know what it's like to be pushed out of my wheelchair. I know what it's like to be spat in London. I know what it's like to face disability hate crimes, which are a growing problem in the UK and in fact worldwide. So my perspective suddenly had changed completely. And I wanted to continue my work, and we created a foundation so that I could both go back and be a photographer, but also directly support the communities we were working with. And this is where the idea suddenly changed in my mind about empowerment, because I suddenly realized that most of my life I had looked at the people I was working with and in many ways seen the problems being theirs. You know, how do we help them to get over their problems? And then I realized, having had my perspective completely flipped, that the problem was coming from people such as me when I had that white privilege. It was coming from the institutions, it was coming from the way that things were set up. And so what I realized was that now my job was to break down those institutions. So what I say we do as a foundation is we look at the problems, and it's our job to try and break down some of those barriers, to try and resettle some of those rights so that people can empower themselves.
Yeah.
You cannot empower someone else, but you can break down those barriers. And as I say, what I realized, having gone through that journey, and as I say, that gift that I was given, is that I realized I had my perspective completely wrong. And that as the majority, if you want to call it that, we were the ones with the problem. And it was up to us to correct it, which would enable others to be empowered themselves.
It's such a good point that you bring, and I really do believe that language matters. Actually, one of my dear friend, who's also a friend of Jodie's, just passed away recently, and I would like to pay homage to him today because most of his work was spelled with the category which was uncategorized. And he was an incredible photographer. His name is Shimodu, and I invite our audience to check him out. He just passed away just a few days ago, and he himself used the art of photography to be uncategorized. He didn't want to be in a category. He was approaching photography and photojournalism in Bangladesh as much as he covered hip hop and rap stars around the world. Jody, you're very good with language because and wording. You're an author. You just came out with your second book. How does it feel to you to spell? Because I feel like we have to spell human rights every year, every day, everywhere, in every business, in the street, so that we don't get spat on. In the courtrooms for you, Amanda, what are the words that you are using? Empowerment is a great one. What is it that you use to represent and make sure that the human rights of LGBT people are respected?
Well, this is a tough question because I think the words aren't enough. I mean, oftentimes we find that words aren't enough to describe the human experience. And that is why when I talk about close proximity, we have to live with one another. And somehow we will understand each other beyond the words. I didn't know what transgender meant. And I think most of us have a difficulty with the evolution of language and the evolution of words. And there are caveats to each word. When you say peace, it's peace for some, and in some situations. And you say freedom, it's freedom for some in some situations. And so I think the difficulty is that words aren't big enough. And I think that we need to expand the vocabulary. But more than that, I think that this idea of storytelling and visual telling and proximity are where the change happens. And then slowly but surely the language will evolve. One thing that's really interesting is that although it seems very difficult to be united around these polarizing issues, language can actually break those barriers if we think about it. My children's grandfather is from Ghana, and in his language of Twi, there is no gender pronoun usage. So for him, his relationship with his trans grandson verbally became quite easy. He didn't have to worry about the gender issue of language. And so I just encourage us to be flexible with our language, but more so experience the people, and then the laws perhaps will unfold in a better way, more just way.
Thank you, Jody. Actually, I'd like to say hi to Krystal Olivieri, who's just joined us. We were having technical difficulties, and it's so important that you're here because I think, or at least I wonder, if your aspects, the aspect that you're covering on human rights, which is data, and our ways of being online or virtually, is not going to bring us all together, because whether you're a woman or LGBT, I mean, obviously I know that you get different kinds of treatment online if you are a woman or LGBT or a colored person. But I'm curious to see your perspective, and perhaps you can start by introducing yourself, because when we were preparing for this topic, data kept kind of inserting itself in every single aspects of every right and every people. So that kind of brings us together, whether we like it or not. We are all feeling the infringement of our privacies within data and the loss of rights.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Krystal Olivieri, and I lead our innovation group at Group M globally, which is the largest media investment organization in the world. And I spend a lot of my time talking about data rights, data ethics, and how brands and companies use their data. And I think that that's right, Nora. We really, in general, how companies are using data is often not understood, and I'll go into a bit more of that in a minute. But what it does is it can actually hinder a conversation as opposed to help a conversation, because what it creates segments, or it creates groupings of people who might have one thing in common. So maybe you are LGBTQ. Potentially, you're all being treated the same way within that bucket. So you're not actually having conversations between different groups of people. And that's where data can actually be harmful in some ways as opposed to helpful, because you see the content that you want to see, you see the content that the algorithm thinks you should see, and as a byproduct of that, it creates this sort of like blinders where you're only hearing that and you're only seeing that, so you're not learning about the different views. So if you're someone who is potentially less open-minded or has not had experiences into transgender individuals, or has not had someone that was a gay friend, you may never get that content. You may never get those connection points, because the data behind the scenes actually keeps you away from that content as opposed to exposing you to it. So I do think it's a really important topic.
It's essential. Amanda, I saw you nodding when we were talking about wordings and narratives and language, and you also are a master of words. What would be, because we discussed a lot about how hard, why is it harder today to be an activist? I know you do such an amount of work. I know you've been working pretty much all night, and you're still here with us today, all the way from DC. And congratulations on those bills that you've passed. But you've become a master at using words to fight and to make sure that the rights of women are being respected. What would you say are the requirements today, and what kind of words are you using to make sure the words have power? What are the words that you're using for your power?
Empathy, radical empathy, is at the heart of our organizing. And radical empathy requires being at times uncomfortable, sitting in spaces that were not meant for us, seeing the humanity in someone who doesn't see it in us, because we have to persuade these people who hold power, and power doesn't give up power easily. We have to persuade these people to see a different future and to understand that our liberation is tied to theirs. It's tied to everyone's. In the sexual assault survivor world, the word victim and survivor are important distinctions. Some people prefer survivor because it allows people to move beyond their trauma. And there's this trope for survivors of rape to be placed on a glass pedestal in a glass box, forever performing their trauma and not giving them the ability to grow beyond it. this voyeurism stagnates people, stunts people, and survivors absolutely should be able to not only survive, but also thrive. And so words are so important. Beyond that, though, we live in such polarized times, and for me, organizing and activism are actually two different things that are very necessary. Activism is straight voltage, and organizing is directed energy. Both are necessary. Deciding what it is that we want to do, and then moving forth with that, dictates the words that are used. So if you are, for instance, trying to negotiate a controversial piece of legislation, then organizing perhaps is a route that you'll take in order to get more people to vote. If your goal is to raise awareness, then maybe activism is a way for you to get what it is that you're trying to achieve. Beyond empathy, I think the critical other aspect is authenticity. It's being able to say from heart to heart, we are all humans. We are all on this floating rock together, floating through space like the overview effect. And let's come and recognize our humanity in one another. So empathy and authenticity, those are two of my favorite words, at least.
Thank you, Amanda. You're preaching to the choir, because empathy is at the base and the core of what Who Cares does, is trying to bring empathy in the corporate world and beyond. And when I'm still kind of shaken by your story, by being spat on. Ndaba, you and I talk about empathy often when we can. When the core of your book also was about the empathy that was bestowed upon from your grandfather. How do you bring empathy into your work, and how do you? I mean, the work of your grandfather was based on empathy as well, and that's probably why Amanda got the Nelson Mandela Prize award herself. So I feel like she's also a spiritual granddaughter to your grandfather. But what would be your take on the wording and the narrative, and how you use words to give you the power to fight for what you believe and for the rights of the people that you represent?
Well, yes, empathy is a good one, when you want to, when you're engaging with certain groups and people, right, you need to have empathy in order for you to understand what truly is the problem, so you can find a solution together. However, I prefer the word compassion. Compassion, When you meet people, regardless of what they look like, where they come from, you treat them with equal respect and with dignity. Because with us, it's about compassion. Compassion, compassion. You need to have compassion to be a good leader. And each of us here are all leaders because we're activists, right? You don't have to be a leader in the sense of the word, oh, where are my followers? No, you are a leader because you are authentic to yourself. You know who you are, like my sister Amanda has said, and you know where you're going. Or you know the people that you want to serve. When you want to serve people, you don't go there with preconceived notions, right? You go there and you listen and try to have empathy, right? Because you have, the compassion took you there in the first place, right? So for me, like my sister Jody says, words, yes, we see them, but it's about the action that truly makes things change, right? It's about when we decide that, for the next 3 days, I'm going to put away my phone, I'm going to go and march and stand next to my sisters and brothers as we walk towards that memorial, right? To make a stand against, what has happened to Black people in America. To make a stand as to how our immigrants are being treated when they arrive in Europe, right? Or whatever stand it is that you're making. It's about the action at the end of the words. Yes, Words are important, but the action, ladies and gentlemen, is what's going to make the true change, not words.
Thank you, Ndaba. That's so powerful. Thank you. Actually, that's a great segue, because Krystal, when you developed an incredible initiative around data to make sure that we would have more privacy, and you used the word that you wanted to bring empathy and responsible use of data into the forefront of your initiative with Group M. I've been challenged by that, because I don't know how or when I decided one day to wake up and say, I'm going to start an initiative and bring empathy back to the workforce, in the corporate world particularly. And it's been such a journey, and I'm still struggling with it. So give me some clues here. Help me out.
Yeah, that was, you know, when you sit in such a large organization, and I do think that our organization is great and is always trying to evolve, but when you sit in a large organization, you notice that sometimes what's being said at one level and how you're behaving at the next level, there can be a breakdown or difference. Data is such a complicated topic because so much of data lives behind the scenes. And it's very different, you know, we're talking about words versus actions here. When you stand in front of a stage or you stand in front of people, it's very clear what you're saying. Like, how people want to interpret it might be different, but your words are your words. When you're using data behind the scenes to make decisioning to determine who you will or who you won't reach out to, there isn't that same level of transparency or that same level of obligation, at least at the forefront. And you can see bad actors or uneducated actors. I won't even always say a bad actor. It might just be someone or something that didn't realize that that's not the way they should do it. Using data in ways that can actually be oppressive or harmful or go against what is in a human's best interest. So there was a period of time where I was getting requests, and the emotion that I felt was, I used the phrase icky, but I felt really icky as I was going through some of these. And we would go back and forth with our legal team, and our legal team would say, like, Krystal, there's not technically anything legally wrong with this. You're having a moral dilemma. And I said, cool, so can we do something about that? And we started to create data ethics principles. But I had the same issue. The data ethics principles were one sort of set of statements, but how do you change 38,000 people to interpret those data ethics principles the same way? How do you actually ensure that when you are making that decision at that last second, the principles are becoming the reality and you're removing as much subjective bias as possible? And that was sort of the approach with that data ethics compass, and this notion of just because you can doesn't mean you should, which we really wanted brought into our people. So we used actually software as a way to drive process innovation across our business. We approached it in a very specific way that put the decision-making process in the hands to the keyboards of all of our employees. But I'll be honest, Nora, what I actually found was that a lot of our employees and a lot of our brands wanted that type of tool. They wanted to be better. They wanted to do better. They wanted to help drive the change that they knew was needed. How to get there was the problem. So we've seen it very, very embraced by our groups, which was also extremely powerful, because it's one thing to do all this work, but if you can't get anyone, as I think you use the word persuasion, if you can't persuade people to actually lean in and adopt those capabilities and make them a core part of your process, you can't actually drive the meaningful change. It becomes a lot of substance level narrative without actual depth behind it. So it's a process, and you keep chipping away slowly at times, but I find that when you can, at least within a big organization, when you can build something that answers a need for the business, that answers a need for where your principles lay, and that also make things easier, because that's the other problem, is how do you drive change if there's so much blockage? Humans, not this group, but you know, a lot of humans are like, oh, that was too hard. I'm just going to keep things the way they were. So how do you kind of think about all those different parts as you're trying to make a change to the way people show up?
Thank you, Krystal. That's an important point. Actually, ChangeNOW is all about action. So Ndaba, I love your point about words have to be followed by action. It's about walking the talk, and it is. And that's why I mentioned the kimono pact at the beginning, and there's already 50 signatures of companies that are willing to be more transparent and make sure that their purpose is very clearly aligned with the values of human rights and transparency and commitment to the planet and its people. So again, I invite all the companies in the audience to sign this pact if they can, or at least look into it. But in terms of actions, we have a few minutes. I would like to have all of you tell us what is next for your actions and your activism. And Amanda, maybe you can start telling us. I know you just mentioned that you just got 2 new bills signed up and passed about, and I just want to see what's next for you and what else you have in store for us in terms of actions. And I will do that with each one of you to close.
You know, it's my dream to wake up in a world where world leaders recognize rape as an issue that deserves to have a full dialogue on. The United Nations General Assembly has never passed a resolution that solely focuses on rape. That might be surprising or unsurprising, but rape has always been a subcategory of another issue. For instance, violence against women, but of course, men and boys and non-binary individuals are also survivors, or rape in the context as a weapon of war, but most rape happens outside of war. So what we're doing right now is fighting for a worldwide sexual assault survivor bill of rights that takes place as a United Nations General Assembly resolution. And that's because peace is not the absence of visible conflict. In order for there to be true peace, survivors need to have access to justice. And I'm so proud of the chorus and coalition of survivors and allies from all around the world who are a part of this campaign. So up next, the United Nations.
Thank you, Amanda. We'll be there. We'll document, and hopefully you can come back next year and tell us all you've done. Ndaba, tell me. Are you still with us?
I want to inspire and ignite the courage inside people to find the Nelson Mandela inside of them to make sure they always stand up for what's right.
Thank you. That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Thank you, Ndaba. It's true, we can all walk outside and embody values and his principles. That's a big one. Jody.
Well, I think as you know, from my perspective, I just wish that we would stop asking for so much data to validate people and experiences. Because I think when we try to ask each other, prove to me that you make sense, it is so dangerous. And so I guess what I would like to see is less data, more interaction, closer proximity to one another so that we can develop mental flexibility around our differences and ultimately stop identifying others as the other. It really is not about others, and my son is not an other. Millions of trans folk are not others, and LGBT folk aren't others. And to really see this as a we thing. We are, not they and I, but we.
Yes, and that takes a lot of work. And thank you so much again for the 2 books that you've written on that, because it does help contextualize. I think contextualization is very important. You're right about the data. But I think that from the empathy point of view, you don't know what people are going through unless you actually read a very compelling story, and it's what you've provided us with. So thank you. I highly invite you to read both of Jodie's book, and they're available on the ChangeNOW website. We're promoting it. Giles.
Well, you know, for me, the first thing I'd like to say is about human rights. I think too many people from privilege see human rights as a gift. They see it as something they can bestow on people. I see it that it's correcting historical imbalances or injustices. And it is not a gift to be bestowed on people, but something that has to be corrected. For me, working in I hate the word charity sector or NGO, I call it the development sector. But working in the development sector, for me, I'm trying through our organization to set an example of how I think things should be broken back down and restarted. And that's all about putting the power in the hands of the people we work with. Again, traditionally called beneficiaries, we call them partners. An example of that is we have a project called Land for Women in Rwanda, and it's working with cooperative farms, with women who are survivors of sexual violence and the genocide. Traditionally, cooperative would be set up and that land would belong to the NGOs. We hand the land to the women right at the beginning. It is now their land and they choose to work with us. And for me, that's how I'd like to see the development sector start to work, is that that power is taken away from the head offices in Geneva and in London and actually handed to the beneficiaries and partners, and then they choose to work with those organizations, not the other way around. So for me, the objective that I want to keep working on is to change that power dynamic, take the power away from the leaders in Geneva and London and give it to the people so they can control their own lives.
Thank you, Giles. Krystal.
For me, I would like to see, so data is never going to go away. And I think that that's an important bit as we go more technical and as more becomes online, with the good or the bad, as I dealt with today. Data is there, it's flowing, and it's accessible. What I would like to see is more and more companies use that data for good and only collect the data they need. So there are a few reasons why I think collecting the data you need and only the data you need is very important. There are actually environmental impacts to the amount of data that you collect, you manage, and you query every day. Most people don't even think about that. But where you have 37,000 emails in your inbox that you haven't deleted, it's like driving a dump truck of garbage into the ocean every day. The impact is substantial. So for big brands and companies and governments, it's around collecting the data you need, not just the data you want, and how do you decide that? And that needs to be rooted in data ethics principles. I would love for every company not just to have privacy policies, not just to be focused on the baseline requirements of GDPR or CCPA, but actually thinking about what do I want my brand to stand for? How do I build principles that go above and beyond? And how do I use the data that I collect for good and for meaningful experiences? And the third piece that I think I would, I'm going to continue to champion for, and I would love to see more of, is how do we use data to provide a more inclusive experience, not an exclusive one? And when I talk about that, I talk about things like the elections, the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, the various civil unrests that we've seen. A lot of those are also based on data. Data being used to actually create segregations within our population as opposed to unite people together. I talked about it before, but when you're only getting, and when we have this much data, I'd actually really love to see the companies of the world using that data to see when there is a dangerous pattern taking place with content and content consumption, and starting to ensure that there are these more inclusive experiences, that you're not just getting the things that we think you like, but other content that's important and breaks down those barriers and connects and unites people. So those are some of the areas that we are going to be focused on next, as well as how we make sure that the data being used and collected actually moves forward things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, which kind of goes towards my last topic, but in just a bit more detail, like data has to be beneficial to all. Especially when it's used in advertising, especially when it's used by big brands, it needs to be used to up level, not to just manipulate or change a mindset to get people to buy a product. So I'm hoping to be able to continue that work and to really challenge the way we had been to get us to a better world forward.
Thank you so much. In closing, I really want to, I know this panel was about human rights, and human rights are fundamental. They're a beacon of peace, they're a promise of peace. Actually, I'd like to do a little shout out to my daughter who made this little bird, this dove of peace for this little panel. She prepared that for Mother's Day, so thank you, Linda Marlowe. But the thing I really want in closing is to how it is important to reaffirm and recognize the codependence of human rights and animal rights. And we're not going to go into this whole topic, but I think we're also arriving into a breakthrough as humankind, where we are sort of expanding into the place of animals in our human rights, and how they are codependent, and that they should be conceived as such. that could be the topic of a next conversation at Change Now. And thank you so much to all the heroes for change. I know you guys do so much behind the curtain to make sure that human rights are respected in the US, in the UK, in Europe, Ndaba in Africa, and in Change Now, I think, as an opportunity to bring forth these conversations. These are sometimes uncomfortable conversations, but we need to have them in order to have human rights being respected and for our world to be better and hopefully a place of peace and understanding for us all. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you. Thank you, Giles. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you. Thank you, Jody. Thank you, Krystal. Thank you, Ndaba. Yes. Have a great day in the US, because I know it's morning for you guys. Bye.